All right. So hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, we have an amazing lineup. I'm looking forward to hearing other people as well. So just a bit about me. I'm Kirtana Chandrasekaran, and I work for Friends of the Earth International. And this is us, lovely people. And we are a grassroots environmental justice network. And the only things that I'm just going to say, I mean, you can read about what we do. Which is relevant to NBS is that one is that we work on a host of different interconnected issues. So I work particularly on food sovereignty and land issues, but we also work particularly on forests and biodiversity, on climate justice and energy, on economic justice and resisting neoliberalism. And so have a kind of rounded view of how all these things kind of knit together, which you'll hear now in my presentation. And of course, our work is very much with social movements and grassroots communities. So everything we do is based on what we see happening on the ground. So that's us, Friends of the Earth. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is nature-based solutions. So, I mean, I think I want to just say three things before I really get into a bit of, the detail of it, is that nature-based solutions is probably not the same as some of the other false solutions that you're going to hear today, like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, because it's quite vague. And, it doesn't have a very clear definition. And that's one of the big problems with it. So it can mean anything to anybody. So, partly because of that, and because it's a really an emerging issue, it's really become a massive thing, I would say, in the last year or so, in terms of false solutions. We at FOI, we don't particularly have a position on this yet. We have lots of positions on the things I'm going to say, but not on NBS as a whole. And so the reason I want to talk about it, and as FOI, we're very concerned about it, is because it's really rising up the agenda really fast as a big, perhaps one of the primary false solutions that's going to be pushed. And I suspect it will become a justification for another big push for carbon markets at the next COP. So that is why. So I wanted to ask people what you think of when you say the word nature-based solutions. And this is one kind of picture of what people would like. A lot of people who do work in civil society or community groups. So they would say it is things like protecting mangrove forests as kind of a natural solution for resilience to hurricanes and things. Agroforestry, fantastic, is, silvopasture, integrating animals and forests and trees for fertilizers, all good stuff. Agroecology, which is the bulk of my work, which is really about, completely transforming intensive agriculture systems into something else that is more just and ecological. Things like peatland restoration, which has been a huge campaign in the UK and across the world for more than 20 years. So there's a lot of organizations who, especially in the UK, I would say, who are quite excited about this terminology of nature-based solutions. And it's kind of understandable because in a way, it is the picture that they want to show is of, all these lovely things that we've been all working on for decades that are now getting attention in the climate movement. And it actually means, climate finance, serious attention in terms of policies, but also maybe, joined up solutions that it could really work. So it's kind of understandable that that's what people would like to see. But the reality of what I'm going to show you is why it's coming up in international spaces, especially, and where the push for nature-based solutions is really coming from. And that is very much linked to the net zero discussion, which is, just to say a little bit, because I'm the first speaker, just in case people don't know exactly what net zero means, is basically that, you know, all the emission reduction pathways that the IPCC, most of them in the IPCC reports, use two types of carbon accounting. One is actual emission reductions, and one is carbon sequestration. So, you know, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that is what is called net zero, the balance between the two. But in reality, I'm sure you can all guess, having probably worked on these issues, it can obscure a lot of things, like all the things we're going to talk to you about now. And so all of these are, what we're going to talk to you is also called so-called negative emissions technologies. So it also includes things like geoengineering, which we're not talking about now, which is also negative emissions technologies, is also NET, so it's also nets and net zero. So it can be a little confusing, but there's net zero and there's negative, which are negative emissions technologies. So those are the two. And just to give you an example, in the last UK Committee on Climate Change report, I was just happened to be reading through it for another reason. And you can see that the UK, they have raised the UK's contribution from negative emissions technologies to 40% of the UK's mitigation budget. And that's completely insane. They're basically saying that, you know, the UK is going to 40% of its emissions reductions are going to come from these types of technologies. So at the time it was mainly about Beccs, but now it's increasingly about tree planting, for example, which they all love. So really when the other side, and I'll tell you who they are talking about nature-based solutions, they're talking about things like carbon markets. They're talking about resource grabs and control over resources in the global south mainly. Offsets, which is, I don't think I need to explain what offsets are, but if anyone has a question about that, I will. And of course, PR. Yeah, so that's basically what this is about. And this Net Zero Festival is happening now in the UK pretty soon. I think this is next week or even this weekend, where basically you have all the big corporations, NatWest Bank, Shell, fossil fuel companies, Drax. I mean, you're the who's who of polluters and some NGOs as well, to come together to discuss how wonderful it's going to be when Shell goes net zero. So, so the first thing to say is that, you know, what is nature-based solutions? And it's a bit vague, and some people call, there are different definitions, and I'm not going to put all that up because you can probably look it up. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has one definition. Other places use other definitions, so it doesn't really matter. But it's basically about trying to supposedly using all sorts of different conservation practices and techniques that will also help mitigate climate change. So some people use the term natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions slightly interchangeably. Nature-based solutions tends to be even wider. So it's even things like green infrastructure projects, as you'll see. But the whole push for this natural climate solutions is based on this one paper, basically, which was written in 2018, mainly written by an NGO called the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the biggest well-funded and conservation NGOs who works a lot with different corporations, saying that, you know, we could use so-called natural climate solutions to deliver 30% of global emissions reductions. And that sounds great, but when you actually start to look into, first of all, that paper and the science, and this is what the whole platform of this, what you see on the screen, Nature for Climate, which is a massive initiative with all the big corporations and massive NGOs, and was launched last year. And it's one of the things that really pushed nature-based solutions onto the global scene, is based on this supposed science from this paper. But if you start looking into it, it basically is, a lot of it is about repackaging things that have been tried before and have been massive failures. So a lot of it is essentially red projects. so which are reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and REDD+, which was added on later, which includes also forest restoration and afforestation, which is basically planting trees, tree monocultures to a large extent. So basically half of that, what they calculate, is so-called reforestation, for which they say you need 678 million hectares of land. I don't even know how big that is, but it's very big. Probably half the size of England, something like that is what I read. And the question is, where is that land going to come from? And they make a lot of claims about where it's going to come from. So a big one is about, from reduction in meat and dairy consumption, which is completely unrealistic. But also that land, which has been grabbed for intensive cattle production, actually belonged to forest-dependent peoples in the first place. And there is no land on earth that exists, as we saw earlier on in the biofuels debate, which does not have some local communities living on it. So, I mean, it's a crazy idea that, you're going to get this amount of land. They also admit that there's going to be 10 million hectares of industrial tree plantations that will be planted in the global south. And that is, I think, something like the size of Greece, that much area. And industrial monoculture tree plantations, I don't need to say anything about it because you're going to hear a lot about it later, come with a huge amount of problematic human rights abuses and problems for communities as well. And then the part that they talk about reducing deforestation, which sounds like a good goal, which it is, for its own sake, not as an offset for Shell. It comes, so the way that they're going to reduce deforestation is that, it comes along with agricultural intensification. So this is a so-called land sparing discussion where you intensify agriculture where it is and try to spare forests. But it's kind of nonsensical argument because, first of all, industrial agriculture is one of the leading causes of deforestation, and you can't decouple them so easily because of, things like feed for intensive cattle production requires land, and if you have more cattle in intensive production, you need more feed. But also just the industrial agriculture model, which is heavily dependent on mining of various things for fertilizers, for example, chemicals, but pesticide use. So it has a massive impact on ecosystems. So it has this very bizarre logic. And also not to mention the social impacts, which is that, the whole model of tree plantations, industrial agriculture, is the leading cause of also the killing of human rights defenders in the last few years. So none of this is kind of taken into account. So if you really look at what this paper is saying, it's a model that's completely unjust because it's expecting those people, as always, in the global south, local communities, indigenous people, who are doing the most to protect nature and doing the least to contribute to the climate crisis, should bear the brunt of these so-called nature-based solutions, which will grab more land. It's an extremely colonialist mindset in terms of, where the land is going to come from. It still is in the frame of the neoliberal logic that we can continue basically along the same lines, consuming the amount that we have with market-based mechanisms, and we're somehow going to find our way out of the climate crisis through all this. And also a very extractive mentality, that forests are really a place to extract more carbon for corporations to continue what they're doing. I'm going to start speeding up, I think. And in the other place that nature-based solutions really got pushed is in last year's, in the 2019 New York Climate Summit, which was very high profile and where nature-based solutions was one of the work streams there. And it's led by China and New Zealand, that work stream. And if you read it, it's pretty horrific, some of the things that they are considering nature-based solutions in that. So I've put two examples here. One is the, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially proposing 6 massive economic corridors through ports, energy infrastructure, fishery, you name it, and they're going to build infrastructure through all those in 64 countries around Eurasia. So you can imagine the level of destruction that's going along with this project. And they basically, one of the initiatives is the greening of the Belt and Road, and that's going to be considered as a nature-based solution. The other one is something I talked about earlier, supposedly promoting sustainable and emissions-efficient crops and livestock systems, which essentially means less carbon per unit of livestock produced, which means in extremely intensive systems, which bring down the number of days that the animals will live, the amount of meat, it's really like those economies of scale and production, which will come out much better as like a carbon. So this is going to be considered as well a nature-based solution. So I just want to touch on some of the examples of really why this is super problematic. And one of the big things is resource grabbing for nature-based solution. So last year, again, we had a lot of corporations. So Shell announced that they are planning a 300 million budget for nature-based solutions, mainly tree planting. ENI announced that they are going to plant 8 million hectares of tree plantations in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Ghana. That is actually an area of half the size of England. And at the same time, ENI are involved in a massive exploration for gas in Mozambique, which was found to have the 9th largest gas reserve. And all these corporations are absolutely rubbing their hands because Mozambique has also extremely corrupt government, very bad governance systems, very easy corruption. And they've all projected to spend something like 60 billion USD to exploit these reserves. And it's the largest ever investment in gas in sub-Saharan Africa. And all these projects, so we are working very intensively on some of these in Mozambique. They're already, so the actual extractive projects are going to have already kicking people out of their homes. There have been killings, and it's really, really horrific militarized area, this Cabo Delgado area. And at the same time, on the other side, ENI is then going to take control of several million hectares of land in Mozambique, supposedly to offset the emissions from this project that they're doing. So you can see that the logic of what they're trying to do. So it really is basically, so either they're going to plant forests or supposedly protect existing forests. But once again, the false existing forests are really already being protected by small-scale food producers, peasants, and indigenous peoples and local communities who are living in Mozambique, who are extremely dependent on those forests and the land for their livelihoods. So either way, it's a double land grab. It's like a win-win situation for them. And this is how the nature-based solutions logic is going. The other thing
Kirtana, just want to jump in. Just gonna say one more minute, just because we need to move on to the speaker.
Okay, cool.
Sorry, don't want to interrupt.
I mean, that the second thing that I mentioned already is that it's very clear that nature-based solutions is going to be a reason for carbon markets to be pushed again, because they were stopped at the last COP, mainly by a lot of activism from indigenous peoples and environmental justice groups. And now there's several new initiatives for markets for nature-based solutions. So this is going to be the new push. So I think I just wanted to, probably finish up by saying, that it's partly the failure and all the corporate strategies, but also the logic of what they're trying to do. And we've always said that forests are not carbon. Agriculture is not just carbon. And if you do this type of reductionism, it brings you to these kind of crazy situations that they want to have, where nature is, broken down to exist in capital markets. And that's a logic which we have to fight at all times. And maybe the last thing, this is actually the last slide, because I didn't want to finish without saying that, all these are false solutions, but on the other hand, we do have real solutions. And a lot of them is in real agroecology and community forest management, which is, based on all these shared principles, and conservation by indigenous peoples is known to be the most effective way of protecting ecosystems. And at the same time, along with that, a massive redistribution of resources and a change in the way we have set up our systems. So, we do have some of the real solutions that we need. And that's it. And there's my Twitter. I'm always happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for confirming. So yeah, hi again, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for having me in the webinar. I'm really excited to be part of this great lineup of panelists. Just a brief introduction to who we are. So Global Forest Coalition is a global member-based coalition of NGOs, indigenous peoples organizations, and women's rights groups working to defend social justice and the rights of forest people in forest policies at all governance levels. And an important part of the work we do under our campaign, Forest and Climate Change, but also this is, of course, cross-cut into other campaigns, is that we focus on the drivers of deforestation and land conversion to monoculture tree plantations and forest-related false solutions to climate change mitigation. And of course, as part of this work, we are tackling and advocating against increasing corporate capture that we are seeing in climate and forest-related policies. So Kirtana has already mentioned how and why net zero strategies can be problematic to address climate change mitigation. And also she has explained really well the problems that we can find around nature-based solutions and how the term can be used to greenwash and rebrand all the well-known false solutions and schemes, only maybe with a bit more catchy name, I would say. And I'm going to elaborate on one of the most popular activities that we can find under the nature-based solutions umbrella. And that is also part of the strategies that are being put forward to achieve net zero commitments. And these activities are tree planting. In fact, it seems, I'm sure you've heard of this, it seems that there is a fever with this tree planting. And well, of course, the key role that forests play to mitigate climate change and also, of course, for adaptation has been already widely recognized for many years ago, and also all the other benefits that forests can bring, like regulation of water cycles, protection of biodiversity, preventing soil erosion, and it's of course a key part of the livelihoods for many communities and indigenous peoples around the world, and also part, of course, of their culture and or their spiritual life. So in principle, hearing this, we should be excited, right, about this tree planting fever that has taken hold of governments and private sector too. But, and also Kirtana touched upon this, there are some questions that I think we should ask ourselves when we read about all of these tree planting initiatives, mainly when these are like large scale tree planting initiatives, like, are these tree planting initiative being led and governed, not only led, but also governed by communities that live or use the lands where these activities are going to take place? Or, what's really going on under all these commitments and initiatives, and why are companies such as Shell so interested in this? I mean, what are we really planting here, right? What's going on? So sadly, on too many occasions, the answer to these questions are monoculture and commercial tree plantations instead of forest, land and forest carbon offsets, conflicts with communities over the land, and no climate mitigation benefits. And well, let me elaborate a little bit on this. So as I just mentioned, the big problem here, or one of the problems, is that monoculture tree plantations is what is being promoted under many of these tree planting efforts, which are also disguised as nature-based solutions. And well, monoculture tree plantations are, of course, by definition, not forests, or it should be by definition. And they don't bring any of the benefits forests bring to climate, biodiversity, to communities. And well, in fact, such plantations in most of the cases lead to land grabbing, to displacement of communities, to human rights violations, freshwater scarcity, biodiversity loss, and well, many other negative impacts. But in addition, plantations can only store a fraction of the carbon that forests can store. And the emissions from the land, from clearing the land that usually takes place to establish those plantations, or the displacement of other land uses like agriculture, often actually undermine any mitigation potential. And another main flaw that monoculture tree plantations have as a mitigation strategy, and this is also common to other land and forest-based strategies like RED that Kirtana mentioned, is the issue of permanence. So permanence, in this case, when we say this, we mean that the carbon is stored in trees in a temporary manner, because eventually this carbon is going to be released back into the atmosphere, and this can happen because the tree dies, because it is cut down, or because it burns. And actually, the issue of burning is becoming a bigger issue in light of the increase in the frequency and severity of wildfires all around the world. So in summary, this means that monoculture tree plantations can only deliver temporary results, and this is a major problem when these temporary results are used by both public and private actors to compensate, to offset their emissions. So all of this together, the monoculture tree plantations, offsetting of emissions, carbon markets where these offsets can be traded, it makes the perfect breeding ground for the private sector and for big polluters to continue with their business as usual. And I just want to very briefly elaborate about the greenwashing plans of a company that is, I think Kirtana also mentioned this, that is part of the Net Zero Festival, and this company, of course, is Shell. So Shell committed to get net zero by 2050, and the plan basically is to offset their emissions by trapping as much carbon as the business operations generate through new carbon capture technologies. That's what we usually refer to as techno-fixes, but also through natural solutions, including tree planting. And they intend to support nature-based solutions and buy carbon credits to offset their emissions by investing about 300 million throughout the next 3 years in tree planting projects. And just to give you a few examples that actually are going to happen in Europe, Shell plans to plant 5 million, I think, yeah, 5 million trees in the Netherlands throughout the next 12 years, 1 million trees in Scotland, and here in Spain, actually they already planted, I just learned about this a few days ago, they already planted 300,000 trees. So these plans are already, being put forward and are being developed. And then another thing that I find very curious, I'll say, or funny about Shell is that they are also offering to their customers in the Netherlands and in UK to buy what they dare to call nature-based credits for the fuel that the customers buy at their stations. And in my view, this is actually a way to nicely ask customers to kind of greenwash on their behalf the emissions that Shell should be taking care of. And this gives also the wrong impression to customers that it is okay to continue using as much fuel as they want, as long as, they buy offset to compensate for this. So, but also Kirtana mentioned this, Shell is not only, of course, is not the only oil and gas company that is making net zero commitments through nature-based solutions and tree planting, but there are many others like Eni, BP, Total, Repsol, Equinor. There is a long, etc. here that, they have seen in this a golden opportunity and have made similar or same commitments. Oops, I can. Yeah, there we go. But also what is really concerning is how net zero and nature-based solutions are being discussed and legitimized very quickly in international climate policy spaces, but also in finance mechanisms, like in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is of course the main body for international climate policy making. And also the Green Climate Fund has already approved projects that involve tree planting through monoculture tree plantations. And this is the main vehicle that the UNFCCC has to channel funds to address the climate crisis. So it's really concerning. And it's also concerning because by legitimizing, I hate that word, these false solutions, we are risking throwing more money at them and giving a green card to polluters like Shell to continue with their business as usual through forest offsets and other kind of offsets and net zero commitments. And I think more importantly, it wastes time that we don't have anymore. I think that if governments do not take the climate crisis seriously and they keep promoting and backing up these false solutions, the companies whose benefit literally depends on the products and the process that have caused the crisis in the first place, and they continue to worsen it, they will never set real ambitious targets. Just to say, Our Nature is Not Your Solution. It was a campaign that we started in May to address these false solutions that are being put under the nature-based solutions umbrella. And I believe that civil society have to keep pushing against false solutions in different spaces and at different governance levels, because we don't have time for this anymore. And we need to advocate and push for real solutions and achieve real zero, not net zero. Real solutions like, for instance, can take the shape of ecosystem-based, community-led and gender-responsive approaches that are, of course, way more beneficial for the climate, but also for biodiversity and for communities. And then I think I'm doing well on time. So just lastly, to wrap it up, I wanted to show you this initiative, because I think that companies like Shell, it's not only that they have to cut emissions, because they do, of course, and stop polluting, but they also have to pay and reverse the harm that they have caused and that they continue to cause, actually, to communities and to the planet. And they have to be held accountable because they knew the consequences of their activities for decades, and they just, opt to ignore it and to place profit over people and continue to co-opt policy making spaces and, to be able to continue with their business as usual. So what you see in the slide, in this last slide, is a joint initiative led by a coalition of civil society and climate justice groups that we work together. Global Forest Coalition is part of this, and we work together to produce what we call the liability roadmap. This was launched very recently, just September 15, and it aims to show policymakers and movements how to use a variety of tools at different governance levels to hold companies like Shell liable. And I think that's it.
Okay. Cool. So you now heard a lot about the effects of those net zero solutions, of those solutions which try to store carbon instead of really cutting emissions elsewhere. So I will talk about this this part of where emissions should actually be cut and where those net zero solutions lead to actually stabilizing the current polluting industry. So now you see the other side of the coin. And since I didn't really know how much you're into the topic of aviation, I just want to start with some general myths and facts about flying, and then go into those green myths and try to decipher them for you. So the first important one is we always hear from the industry that flying has only a very small climate impact. about 2% is what the industry announces and what is repeated by governments and policies. And actually, it's at least 5%, since it's not only about CO2, it's also about other impacts like contrails and NOx. Another myth is that, well, if I'm buying organic, if I take less showers, avoid food waste, or even eat vegan, then sure, it's no problem to fly once in a while. So here you'll see a comparison between different types of consumption and how much actually aviation makes up. So you'll see a long haul flight and a short haul flight, and it's so much. So how come that it makes such a difference in personal footprints, that flying is still only responsible for 5% of climate heating worldwide? I mean, flying is so normal, right? Everyone does it. That's the next myth. So no, you see here a graphic of England with a great difference between who flies and who doesn't fly. So the top 1% took 1/5 of all flights abroad, and about 50% don't fly in a year. But that's nothing compared actually to the global level. And total estimations say that only between 5 to 20% have sit in an airplane, and of those, only some fly a lot. So mostly a few frequent flyers are responsible for those 5% or 5 to 8% of climate heating. Another assumption is that flights are cheap, but actually flights are made cheap while others bear the costs. This has to do mostly with enormous subsidies, which airlines, airplane constructors, and airports are receiving. Direct subsidies plus tax exemptions. So here you see that kerosene is not taxed almost anywhere in the global north. So all the external costs for the environment, for people affected, evicted, harmed by airports, or the harm for future generations isn't priced in. But it cannot be priced in, because how would you set a price on the life of people or biodiversity? And that's actually also something that's a lot part of those nature-based solutions, or of this this direction of green economy, bioeconomy that's being taken right now, that they're trying to price everything in and put a price on nature. It's not possible. But it's clear that instead of setting incentives for flights through cheap prices, incentives should be set to take other forms of transport. So for this, we don't need to price in nature. The aviation industry has been lobbying strongly to keep these privileges, saying that a reduction of aviation is not necessary, because they claim that net zero aviation will be possible in the future. They mostly promote this concept of carbon neutral growth of aviation. So neutrality is basically this net. It allows for producing emissions on the one side, while the other side is supposed to reduce emissions, and in the end you'll have this net zero or neutrality. So in 2016, after decades of postponing climate action for the aviation sector, the UN aviation body, ICAO, which is heavily influenced by the industry, came out with their plan called CORSIA. So it's the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And the plan is to continue growing, but through changes in technology and fuel, and mostly in offsetting, through offsetting. Officially, these emissions would stay at the same levels as 2020, which is way too high anyways, or would have been too high if COVID-19 wouldn't have led to a crisis in aviation, which is why the baseline has been shifted now after strong industry pressure. So it's now actually not 2020 is the baseline, but before COVID-19. Anyways, it doesn't matter. CORSIA is really, well, will not do anything for tackling aviation emissions. So let's just have a look at the myths hiding behind this concept of net zero aviation. first at the technology side and then at what's all around the news all the time, the green fuels, and then at offsetting. So one of those myths is that we can run planes on biofuels, saying that those don't produce emissions. And I'm sure Almuth will in the next input tell a lot more about this, but just quickly to say that palm oil is the most feasible biofuel for aviation, and I think I don't need to say much more about its harm. On this graphic you can see that palm oil is grown where rainforests are situated, leading to deforestation, which is not climate neutral at all. But what about e-fuels? It's all in the news. So e-fuels are basically fuels made from electricity, synthetic fuels or hydrogen, and it's feasible to produce it, but not realistic in the quantities needed. So there are no facilities to produce it yet, and the demand would be immense. If all current flights were to be operated with e-fuels, they would need more than the existing renewable energy of the whole world, leaving nothing for other sectors. So yeah, so much for the alternative fuels. The other myth is we don't need to reduce emissions from aviation. We can just pay others to compensate those emissions. Maybe people in the global south who can reduce emissions cheaper than we can. And it's really cheap. There's just a new study that was released today by Transport and Environment saying that airlines would pay 0.2% of operating costs to offset their emissions. So it's nothing. It would cost nothing, and that's the reason why they chose offsetting as a mechanism that allows them to say, oh, we are actually carbon neutral, or we grow carbon neutral while not changing anything. So offsets are hydroelectric dams, energy efficient cookers, tree plantations, those RED projects which have already been mentioned. And the calculations don't work. So most offset projects have very low likelihood to reduce additional emissions. And here you see in the graphic, you see a study by Öko Institute who calculated that only 2% have a high likelihood that emissions reductions at the UN offsets are real, measurable, and additional. Because of, you know, everything that has been mentioned already, like fires burning the tree plantations and hydroelectric dams, which would have been built anyways, but then are counted as offsets and stuff like that. Also, there are quite some projects that have led to evictions of indigenous communities, human rights violations, and ecological damage, which already has been mentioned too. So for us, for the Stake-Grounded Network, this is really a neo-colonial climate policy that leaves it to others to repair for our catastrophic mode of living and production. Well, actually, this repairing doesn't really work either. So there's really no other way than reducing aviation, degrowth of aviation. The lie that net zero aviation is possible, or the wish that it might be possible in the future, which realistically is not in the next 2 decades or not at all. So this wish and those claims by the industry and all their advertising they are doing on this, it actually diverts attention from the necessity to reduce demand. It's a very strategic move by the industry to keep their unsustainable business models alive. We are working very hard on using this moment of COVID-19 crisis to push for a just transition of aviation, but the industry is also working very hard on spreading myths in order to uphold their privileges. So I hope you all help us in myth busting in order to push back the industry growth. Okay, thank you.
So I'm kind of mainly focusing, oh no, this is the end. sorry, this is the beginning. Right, so I'm focusing very much on drugs here, and I know some of you will be very familiar with drugs, but perhaps not with all the examples I'm giving. And we are focusing on drugs because they are one of the keynote speakers, and their talk is called Going Negative. They'll be speaking on the 1st of October at the Net Zero Festival. But also as an example of what biomass is about, because drugs is the world's biggest biomass burner, and also I would say probably one of the very biggest lobbyists for biomass around the world, not just in the UK. So, really important to engage with this as an example of what's happening on a smaller scale as far as different companies are concerned around Europe and increasingly outside. So a quick review for those not so familiar with drugs. Who are they? Drugs operate the UK's biggest power station. Drugs power station, who used to be in the UK's biggest coal plant, still burning some coal, burns a lot more wood than any other plant in the world, really by a huge stretch. And they're also still invested in gas, or operating gas power plants, smaller gas power plants, smaller but not small. And they want to build the biggest gas power facility ever built in the UK. Hopefully they won't get to, but that's their plan. So huge investor, huge fossil fuel and biomass, which is why, our slogan for protests used to be drugs stop burning all the things, because they literally burn anything except for mixed waste so far. So, they burned, so last year, and that's pretty much every year now, they burned the equivalent of 125% the UK's total annual wood production. This is from a recent banner protest. There were lots of them along the train line. Those trains are transporting the wood pellets, millions and millions of tons a year. But I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a glimpse of what this really, really means, when we're speaking of burning all this wood. So all that wood is imported. None of it comes from the UK. So looking at the different big pellet suppliers for drugs. Those are pictures by people from Dogwood Alliance, one of the US NGOs fighting to protect their forests. This is from North Carolina, and the world's biggest pellet producer by far, in Viva, one of the big suppliers of drugs, literally sourcing a lot of the pellets from the clear cutting of amazingly biodiverse forests. These forests form part of a global biodiversity hotspot. So this is perhaps the biggest and best known scandal involving drugs as far as sourcing is concerned. However, drugs also operates in growing number of its own pellet plants, also in the southeastern USA, and those pellet plants source from loblolly pine plantations. So the southern USA has seen for many decades a conversion of those beautiful forests you saw being clear cut earlier to pine plantations. And this is really speeding up. We fear that the demand for pellets will further speed up replacing the forest with those really empty green deserts, if you like. Now, then another region in the Baltic states, I actually went to Estonia a couple of times. The first, this is Europe's biggest pellet producer, Granul Invest, and we got to look at 3 of the pellet mills. This is a photo from one of them, so you can see all sizes of whole trees again. And on the right, picture of what sadly, increasingly typical landscape in Estonia now looks like. These are not old growth forests, but forests that had been growing since the beginning, since the start of the Soviet occupation in the 1940s. So 80 plus years old forests, also really, really important for wildlife. So that's the next supplier. That's Granul Invest. They are another big supplier of drugs. And of other the same suppliers supply other big biomass plants across Europe. And finally, some pictures from Pinnacle Pellets, one of the really big Canadian exporters, sourcing from British Columbian forests. Now there's a lot more research being done by campaigners, but showing again big piles of whole trees. And these are, this is an area of old growth forest, caribou habitat, land that's supposed to belong to indigenous peoples who are not being consulted. So hugely problematic again, a big supplier of drugs. Now, I'm not going to go into the climate impacts because I kind of think, I've got this quote up here you can read, but I kind of think that most of you understand that chopping down trees and burning them for energy is like not great for the climate. In fact, that includes plantation trees and not just forests. Yeah, so why are they talking about they're going negative? Well, the really big thing is they claim to be developing bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. So the idea is, because they're calling, all this sort of stuff carbon neutral and, having zero impact on the climate, which is of course a complete fraud. Because they can be allowed to call that carbon neutral, they claim that if they can sequester, if they can capture and store a little bit of the carbon from burning wood, if they can store that in geological formations, that this would in future make the whole business carbon negative, and thereby chopping down potentially even more forests will be part of the climate solution. Now, this is quite interesting. This is actually a photo I got from Drax's own website. I think it's from Drax's own website, not sure, the only one. The others are all campaigner ones. And, this is kind of showing the scale of this. This is literally a shipping container, right? This is not a big pilot project. There is nothing, there is nothing really actually happening. So Drax says that they are testing capturing 1 ton of carbon per day. They're not managing to do that, and it's simply a greenwash in the hope that one day they'll get in the hope that they can convince the government to give them more subsidies, yet more money, on the premise that one day in I don't know how many years or decades they'll be able to capture carbon. And this is what BECCS is really about worldwide. So last 2 slides, very brief, is just to say huge increase in demand. This was even from what's expected in 2027. Sorry, I didn't show the 2017 one. A massive increase in what's expected in terms of pellet imports, the yellow ones, and green the exports worldwide, and yet all driven by subsidies. So last year, Drax cashed in on 2.16 million in subsidies every single day for burning wood of our renewable power subsidies. And just a little bit about the campaign, our main campaign. If you want to see, how people can get, what we are mainly campaigning for as a solution is quite simple: stop the subsidies for false renewables and redirect them to stuff that's really going to help the climate. So we are part of this Kirtana or forest campaign together with NGOs from the southern United States at the moment. But this would benefit forests worldwide, and and this would include BECCS. BECCS is not getting subsidies, but we certainly don't ever want it to. So that's a run through to watch out for Drax on the 1st of October at the Net Zero, and that's me.
Yeah, if that's okay with Kirtana. So yes, I think there is a way to utilize nature-based solutions in a fair way, and actually I think that is what we had with ecosystem-based approaches, which is a concept that I believe is defined by the CBD. That's the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the problem with this, as Kirtana said, is that nature-based solutions, if I can recall correctly, it started to be used at the end of the 90s, but mainly on green building issues, infrastructure. And then in the early 2000s, it was put forward to address, as an umbrella, as I said, for ecosystem-based approaches. I think those ecosystem-based approaches that are led and governed by communities and that are, of course, gender responsive are, you know, a way to use, or a nice, so to speak, nature-based solution. Now, my concern now is that this wasn't properly defined at the start, and I'm aware that now there are efforts to narrow or make define better nature-based solutions, but I'm not sure. I think it's perhaps a bit too late for that. That is something that should have been done earlier. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I think you mentioned also something about reframing, or yeah. So yeah, they are being mainly used at the moment, I think, or widely used to rebrand, as we said, false solutions and all the schemes that were already there and that they, you know, they've proven that to fail. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, maybe I can just come in because I think it's a really good question because I think there are several different levels of discussion to be had on this. So one is a strategic level, which is that, yes, of course, you're absolutely right. As I said, there are lots of things that, you know, communities on the ground have been doing for several hundreds of years. Mainly the ones that we promote as genuine solutions are community forest management and agroecology as a kind of catch-all for the many systems by which local communities manage their own territories for governance reasons, but et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of good evidence to show that that is in fact the best way of doing it, much better than protected areas, for example. So that's happening anyway. The question is, what do we want to call it? And do you want to bring it in? How do you want to bring it into the climate debate? And that is, I think, that's a different question because the work is happening anyway. So one thing is, you know, a strategic question, which is that with, especially in the UK, with the COP coming up, that, you know, everything points to the fact that the UK government and the corporations are positioning themselves to push this as like the big thing, you know, that's going to make them look really good. And in that sense, does it make sense for the UK climate movement to also be using that language in a different way? And that's a discussion I think that needs to be had. And I think there will be some organizations that do that anyway. But I think that's something that we need to think about for those who understand what the issues are at stake. The other aspect, which I just want to touch on, which I said at the end, is that a lot of these solutions that are community practice on the ground, they don't necessarily do it only as climate solutions. For them, it's their way of life. They do it for livelihood reasons, for, you know, for their culture, for their spirituality, to produce subsistence agriculture for themselves, for medicines. So there's also a problem about reducing everything to carbon metrics. And that's a huge problem. And so that is also something to be very wary of. And when we do talk about these as climate solutions, but we don't talk about them as carbon solutions. And that's the kind of, I think that's also something to think about.
Okay, so first on carbon offsets. So, I mean, we are completely opposed to carbon offsets. And there's been a debate about those for a long time that I don't want to go into. But from a purely climate science-based view, you know, we are now way above, I mean, clearly, you know, we are way above the limit of sustaining a stable climate in terms of CO2 emissions. And, you know, and we are also in a situation where we can't stop all CO2 emissions entirely tomorrow or, you know, ideally yesterday. You know, we really need to stop emissions ASAP as quickly as possible, and we actually need to harness the solutions we have to absorb some of the carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere. And the only proven way to do that is happening by nature, by existing ecosystems, by healthy soils, and by especially above all by mature forests. Now, so there is no scale for offsetting anything. You know, that even if it worked, it wouldn't get us to where we need to be. terms of biochar, it's actually something that first myself and then my colleague Rachel Smoker in the US looked into at different times. So I did many years ago with Rachel, but Rachel did last year, very looking at really detailed literature review. And I'm afraid there is no evidence that putting any type of charcoal char into soils can be relied upon to sequester any carbon whatsoever. In many cases, it can even lead to losses of soil carbon or have no effect at all. Same picture for soil fertility, and we are really, so the evidence does not back up the claims made about it, and we're really happy to share a literature review with anybody on email afterwards.
In the first place, I think it's great if more people start campaigning on aviation. I mean, actually in the UK, there's a lot more being done because of all the long Heathrow struggles, for example, than in many other countries, but still there's so much left to be done. And as the Stay Grounded Network, what we are trying to do is to really share experiences between the different movements and NGOs and opposition groups, and try to learn from each other and support each other. So if you plan to do anything, then feel free to contact us or to become a member and get all the information we have in order to know what's to be done. But definitely, I think really, well, one thing that needs to be done is really busting those greenwashing myths and writing about why, and campaigning about why this doesn't work. It can also be done by ad busting and by different means. And the other thing is also to really start envisioning how a world with reduced aviation can look like. I think that's something we don't have in our heads yet. I think many people think that it's, well, and it is very core for this hyper-mobile, capitalist, globalized economic system we are in. So reducing aviation would really have big effects on global trade, on business, on mass tourism and quick relaxation for busy people, and well, but also a lot of positive impacts. And I think we have to tell more stories also about the positive changes that can be made when reducing aviation and the alternatives that exist there.
Yeah, so I mean, they are very interconnected, but I would say offsetting is a particular practice that some of the negative emissions technologies use. So the offsets are specifically when you use a scheme. It could be tree planting, but it could be carbon capture and storage. It could be, I mean, in the past, it's been awful. In the clean development mechanism, hydroelectric dams were considered offset projects. And then you can buy credits, so you offset your polluting activities in one place by projects, contributing to projects, mainly in the global south, but also now it's across the global north. So that's the offsetting part. Negative emissions. So negative emissions technologies are basically anything that is supposed to sequester carbon. So anything that draws down carbon from the atmosphere. So trees obviously do that. They would argue, Drax would argue that biofuel production does that. They did argue that previously. Also, for example, I'm trying to think of other things that peatland, obviously, but also storing carbon in soils. So now the discussion about agroecological agriculture practices is about basically how much you can keep carbon in soils, but also draw back down carbon in soils. So all that would be considered negative emissions technologies.
Yeah, I can start. So yeah, some of the real solutions that I can quickly mention, I mean, of course, forest conservation and restoration, we barely talk about that. It seems that at the moment there is, and of course this is not an accident, a lot of the discourse around forest is around afforestation and reforestation rather than on forest conservation and restoration. And addressing, of course, the drivers of deforestation, the real drivers of deforestation, which is something that is often not done. I have to say, last COP in Madrid, I was in a high-level event on forest, and there were ministers from countries like Malaysia, Brazil, I mean, some of the countries with the highest rates of deforestation. None of them address any of the drivers of deforestation in their countries. They only kept talking about tree planting and tree planting. So anyway, addressing the drivers, I think it's also really important, and it's quite concrete or tangible to, of course, changing policies, but also stop giving incentives to some of these destructive corporations. Like, you can see this very easily in the agribusiness sector. And also we have to make governments to stick to their commitments, because, for instance, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and there is SDG 15, which is life on land, and target 15.2, if I can remember correctly, it actually has, as an objective, or is part of the target, to halt all deforestation by 2020, which of course is a target that hasn't been met. So we need also to just hold governments accountable to the commitments that they make. Those are some of the concrete actions that I can quickly put forward.
Sure. So I mean, just a bit, because I also mentioned this envisioning and positive narratives. So I guess for the nature-based stuff, you will have better ideas. But I also think that agroecology, for example, is a very great story to tell. And but for travel without planes, I think, well, in a climate just future, aviation would be operated in the confines of the planet's and countries' carbon budgets. So flights would be prioritized for those who really need them. So we will have discussions about which are bullshit flights and which are necessary flights. For example, for emergencies, for migrants visiting stricken family members on another continent or an island. If no alternatives exist, it might be still important, but for many others, it might be not important in order to really avoid climate breakdown. And it is possible to adapt quickly to a new normality. We saw that now in COVID-19, and we also saw it here in Europe, or in the global north, where people got used to quick city trips by plane, and just in the last 10 years, maybe 20 years. So it's something that can change quickly. Video conferencing has been used a lot during the pandemic and can continue. Decelerated lifestyles and work time arrangements, like a reduction in working hours, more flexible working hours, and chances to take sabbaticals could allow for people to take more time to travel and experience the journey and connect to locals. And there should be a range of comfortable and affordable climate-friendly travel modes like night trains, coaches, sailing and solar ships. And rail stations would be really convenient, have waiting rooms which are actually comfortable, with childcare being offered at associated play sites. And there would be regionalized circular economies that could allow for both the diversity of jobs and local goods, while real global connections will still be important, of course. So I think, they're just some of those visions maybe I have, and maybe you share them and want to tell them too. And for the concrete stuff to be done, I just very concretely, I recommend you to maybe sign up to our monthly newsletters, and therefore find out what you can concretely do for tackling aviation emissions. And right now, I think the window of opportunity is there to really enforce a just transition, and really talk also to employees in the sector, engage in trade unions, and really try to use this moment where actually unemployment is rising in the aviation sector in a very unfair way to make clear that in order to have not another disaster and another degrowth by disaster, we need a good design now.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of made a little plug on our campaign on the biomass subsidies earlier, but in terms of solutions, I mean, I think, look, you know, having worked on biomass and bioenergy for many years now, you know, the main, you know, I mean, my main observation is really that we need to be really, really careful of any type of large-scale techno-fixes. You know, one reason why governments are subsidized, one of the main reasons governments are subsidizing biomass is that it is seen as a quick fix to reach renewable energy targets, very, very focused on reaching targets, you know, because you can use the existing coal infrastructure and very similar infrastructure that you have for fossil fuels already, and just burn wood instead. And of course, we're seeing that this is really really disastrous. So on the one hand, in Biofuelwatch, you know, yes, we would say that we have to absolutely switch to the lowest impact forms of renewables like wind and solar power. But I think we also need to be quite honest that we are really running into real massive problems of scale. You know, the idea that we can keep energy consumption at anything close to today's level globally and do it all on wind and solar, I think that is very, very naive and mistaken. I think, you know, there are impacts. They are smaller than most of biomass, but we absolutely need to scale down our energy use, especially in countries where, you know, which are consuming a lot more energy per capita than we really, really need, because, you know, because keeping in mind that there's still about 2 billion people in the world whose energy needs are not being met or only being met by really polluting domestic wood burning. So yeah, for me, you know, there's basically no way around restructuring and the social and economic changes to actually move towards low energy societies.
Yeah, I think just to say, I mean, in terms of putting forward ideas, you know, for what our solutions look like, I think we do have things that are good for people's well-being and, you know, in the round. So an example from which I've said a lot here, and also Magdalena said it, on agroecology, which is really a movement to completely change the way the food system is organized. So, you know, it is responsible for about 25% of emissions through lots of things, fertilizer, international trade, to really relocalize those systems. It's entirely possible to redistribute the way we use resources. And it has a very good impact on people's lives, things like pesticides and nutrition and access to nature, all these kinds of things. The other one I would say is from the more climate side or fossil fuel side is transport. And, you know, it's a huge win, and nothing's happening. It's kind of incredible that, you know, other than as status symbols, people don't like cars. They don't like traveling in cars. And, you know, I think that would be something that if you massively invest in proper public transport. So there are things that I think we could talk about, and several of those. And I think it's about building those visions. But the other thing I think that, you know, going into the future, especially with this conversation on false solutions, is really to change the narrative on where, because everybody now realizes, or, you know, thinks they know, the public knows that we're in, you know, some kind of climate emergency situation. But, you know, the other side is constantly pushing this vision that of individual responsibility and individual solutions and techno fixes. So that's basically it. You know, that's going to take care of it all. And there's a big job to do, I think, to change the public narrative, or keep pushing in the public narrative the fact that really it is corporations at the end of the day that benefit from the climate crisis. And a lot of the projects you see in the global south will have massive fossil fuel exploration to power mining projects, to then power ridiculous unnecessary consumption. And, you know, so there's a lot we can do if we didn't have the system that we currently live in. So that is what I would say.